This story, written by Gabie Rivera, is about a couple friends visiting a family ranch where extraordinary efforts are put into making demons feel unwelcome. Not a single seat in the house is left empty overnight. Despite these efforts, let's just say that some demonic forces find their way to remind that they are very real. So stay tuned for this gruesome affair. An empty seat invites a demon. Finding yourself in the talons of an owl in the shadows of the forest moonlight, it's a gruesome affair. When I was 13 years old, my mother sent my sister Ruby and me to stay with our grandparents for the summer. Our grandmother Cecilia lived on a ranch in Mexico with our grandfather Alberto and our 7-year-old cousin Rafael, whom they had been raising for a few years. It was a nice ranch, and we enjoyed being around the animals. The house had been recently renovated, and our grandparents had added extra bedrooms to accommodate their grandchildren. Since not all of the rooms were fully furnished, however, Ruby and I shared a room during our visit. On our first day there, Grandma Ceci welcomed us with gifts. A bracelet made from braided red string with an evil eye in the center. She secured it around each of our wrists, and we thanked her for it, although I could tell that Ruby wasn't a big fan. I knew my grandmother was very superstitious, as she had passed down a few of her beliefs to our own mother, but Ruby was always the one to roll her eyes and scoff at the mention of curses or demons. "What's this for?" Ruby asked in a mocking tone, examining the bracelet on her wrist. "It'll protect you from bad luck and negative energy," Grandma Ceci replied. I noticed she had a similar bracelet around one of her wrists, and as I looked around the living room, I noticed a large evil eye placed above the doorway. "Right, of course it will. You think I'm crazy, but I'm dead serious, Ruby," Grandma Ceci lectured. "Do not take that bracelet off, okay?" Ruby groaned. "If it'll get you off my back, I will literally never take it off. I will superglue this onto my skin if it'll make you happy." Our grandfather laughed, and Grandma Ceci glared at him, shutting him up. "That's not necessary, Ruby. Just keep the bracelet on, okay?" She grabbed our bags and began to make her way towards our room, and we followed. "Look, Esme, we have matching bracelets," Rafael said, tugging on my arm. I looked down, and he held out his wrist, showing me his bracelet. "Wow, that's so cool," I replied. He grinned up at me, and Ruby scoffed. "Can't you just pretend to care?" I asked her as we walked into the bedroom and set our bags down on the bed. "It's stupid. Do you really believe in all this stuff?" she asked me. I shrugged as I looked around the room. The walls were painted with a light peach color, and there was some decor that was hung up and placed around the room. There was another evil eye. This one was hanging from a nail in the wall with twine. On the dresser there was a small framed photo of the Virgin Mary and 2 candles with different saints on them that I didn't recognize. Our parents weren't really religious, but I knew that Grandma Ceci was. I noticed a few other religious items in the room, like a rosary hanging above the bed, and a Bible on one of the bedside tables. The rest of the decor was random, an elaborate-looking layout of a few trees that were made of some sort of copper wire, 2 giant framed paintings of fruit baskets, and a framed family picture that had been taken when I was just a baby. "Do you like it?" our grandfather asked, gesturing around the room. I nodded. "It's a lot bigger than I thought it would be." "You girls go ahead and put all your stuff away. When you're done, you can come down for some lunch." He walked out of the room, and Ruby and I spent the next few minutes putting all of our clothes and toiletries away. Raphael sat in a worn-out leather armchair that was pushed up against one of the corners in the room, watching us walk back and forth from the bed to the closet. Once we were done, I put all our suitcases and bags away in the closet while Ruby walked around the room looking at everything. I watched as she stood in front of the dresser, studying the candles. "Who even are these people?" she muttered. "St. Jude and St. Joseph," Raphael replied. "Whatever, let's go eat, I'm hungry." Ruby pushed past me and walked out the bedroom door without even waiting for us. I waited for Raphael to slide out of the chair and walked to the kitchen with him, where Ruby was already serving herself some food. We ate together as our grandparents asked us about school and what we did back home. Once we were done, we sat down in the living room to watch a movie while our grandparents did the dishes. We didn't do much else for the rest of the evening and simply sat around the TV. After a few hours, Grandpa Alberto brought out a tray of coffees and bread, which we ate until it was time for Raphael to go to bed. It was around 8:30 when Grandma Ceci told Raphael to get ready for bed. He begrudgingly got up off the couch, and she left the room with him. After he had changed and brushed his teeth, he came back into the living room to say goodnight to all of us, and Ruby and I waited while our grandparents tucked him in for the night. We sat in silence for a few minutes, absent-mindedly staring at the TV, until I heard Ruby yawn next to me. "Do you want to go to bed now?" she asked me. I hadn't felt tired until she mentioned going to bed, and suddenly I got the urge to yawn. I could sleep, I guess. We got up and turned off the TV and then headed to our rooms. "I call the shower first," I said as I grabbed a towel from one of the drawers. "Whatever, just hurry up," Ruby replied as she let herself flop face down on the bed. I grabbed all my stuff and took a quick shower. As soon as I came out, Ruby took my place and I went back into our room, getting the bed ready and putting my stuff away. I laid down on the left side of the bed and closed my eyes while I waited for Ruby to come back. I heard the shower turn off after a few minutes, and then the bathroom door opened, and the smell of her shampoo wafted into the bedroom. I opened my eyes as she walked into the room and dropped her dirty clothes on the floor near the closet, and I rolled my eyes. Ruby was never the neatest person, and it was going to be annoying to deal with her ways all summer long, but I bit my tongue, not wanting to start an argument now. "Are you girls ready for bed?" I sat up as Grandma Ceci came into the bedroom. She was holding a porcelain doll in her arms. The doll was pale, with green eyes and blushed cheeks. Her hair was tightly curled and pinned under a floppy satin hat with a lace trim that matched her red satin dress. She had white frilly socks on and a pair of shiny black shoes with gold buckles. "What on earth is that?" Ruby asked, spotting the doll. "This is Guadalupe," Grandma Ceci replied, smoothing out the doll's dress. "And what is she doing here?" I watched as Grandma Ceci walked over to the armchair and set Guadalupe down on it so she was sitting, staring at the rest of us in the room like some creepy guardian. "Please tell me you're not leaving that in here," Ruby said. "I am leaving her here." "Why, don't tell me this is another stupid ritual. You already gave us the bracelets. And besides, what the hell is a doll gonna do?" Ruby whined. "An empty seat invites a demon," Grandma Ceci replied, patting the top of the doll's head and turning it to look at Ruby. "You've got to be kidding. I'm not sleeping with that thing watching me," Ruby exclaimed. "Would you rather sleep with a demon watching you?" "There are no demons in here. Even if they wanted to watch me sleep, I'm pretty sure all your evil eyes and saints would scare them away," Ruby said, gesturing around the room. "Please do not remove Guadalupe," Grandma Ceci said, looking at Ruby and then at me. "Don't worry, I won't touch her," I said. "So you're telling me you put a doll in every single seat just to avoid the possibility of a demon?" Ruby asked. Grandma Ceci nodded, and Ruby marched out of the room. We stood in silence, listening to her footsteps as she made her way around the house and then back into the bedroom. Wow, she's not lying. There's a doll in every single seat. Good night, girls. She blew a kiss at us and then turned off the light and closed the door, leaving Ruby standing in the middle of the room in the darkness. I turned my back to the door and looked at the moonlight that shone through the windows, illuminating a section of the room. I'd laid like that, waiting for Ruby to get into bed. But when she didn't, I sat up to see what she was doing. I watched as she stood in front of the armchair, staring at the doll. "What are you doing?" I whispered. "I'm gonna put her in the closet," she whispered back. "Ruby, shh." I watched as she picked up the doll and opened the closet door, tossing her inside and then closing it. There, now I can sleep in peace. I laid back down as Ruby finally got into bed. A few minutes later, I was asleep, having forgotten all about the doll. The next morning when I woke up, Ruby was still asleep. I noticed that the rosary had fallen off the wall and was on her head, so I picked it up and put it back as gently as I could. Then I quietly got up and opened the closet door to get dressed. I noticed Guadalupe on the floor and picked her up, setting her back down on the armchair, and then proceeded to change out of my pajamas and go into the kitchen. The smell of coffee and pancakes made my stomach growl as I realized how hungry I was. "Did you sleep well?" Grandpa asked as I stepped into the kitchen. I nodded and sat down at the table next to Raphael, who was pouring an excessive amount of syrup onto his pancakes. "That's enough, Rafa," Grandma Ceci said, taking the bottle from him and setting down a stack of pancakes in front of me. "Thanks," I said, reaching into a bowl in the middle of the table and grabbing a handful of grapes. I had almost finished eating my breakfast by the time Ruby came in. She was still dressed in the t-shirt and shorts she had slept in, and she was barefoot, rubbing her eyes and yawning as she walked into the kitchen and sat down across from me. "Good morning, Ruby," Grandma Ceci said as she gave her a plate of pancakes. "Morning," Ruby mumbled, grabbing one of the pancakes and biting into it. "You look tired. Did you not sleep well?" Grandpa asked. Ruby shrugged. "I guess I'm not used to sleeping here." Once we were all done eating, we helped clean up, and then I waited for Ruby to get dressed so we could go outside and look around the ranch. Once she was done, we walked outside and past Raphael, who was sitting on a lawn chair playing with some toy cars. "Where are Grandma and Grandpa? I want to see the baby pigs." Ruby looked around the area, but they were nowhere to be seen. We walked towards the barn, which was a few feet away from the house. Just as they were coming out, we met them halfway, and I could tell that something was wrong by the look on their faces. "What happened?" I asked. "Someone killed the pigs," our grandfather said. "What? Even the babies?" Ruby asked. Our grandfather nodded. "It's like a murder scene in there. There's blood all over the walls. It's bad." Grandma Ceci mumbled what sounded like a prayer. "Who would do something like that?" I asked. "Not who. What?" Grandma Ceci corrected. "What?" Ruby asked. "Your grandmother seems to think it was a chupacabra," Grandpa replied. "You're kidding, right? Those aren't real," Ruby said. Our grandmother sighed and our grandfather shrugged. "We should all go back inside while your grandfather cleans up the barn. I don't want you kids to see all of that." We followed our grandmother inside and spent a few hours sitting around the house before she invited us out for some ice cream. As Ruby and I waited for her to come out with Raphael, I noticed her bare wrist. "What happened to your bracelet?" I asked. Ruby glanced down at her wrist as if she had just noticed. "I don't know," she shrugged. "It must have fallen off while I slept. You know what that means. You need a new one, right?" "Shut up, Esma," she sighed in annoyance. I rolled my eyes but didn't say anything back, and instead got into the car. Grandma Ceci and Raphael came out a few minutes later, and I tried to avoid talking to Ruby for the rest of the afternoon. Our grandmother didn't seem to notice Ruby's missing bracelet, And if she did, she didn't bring it up. That night, while we got ready for bed, our grandmother came in again to sit Guadalupe down in the armchair. This time, Ruby didn't argue, but after our grandmother left, she got out of bed and threw the doll in the closet. I said nothing and simply turned my back and fell asleep. An hour or two later, I randomly woke up with a start. I opened my eyes and could see that Ruby was gone. I figured she had just gotten up to go use the bathroom or something, and so I closed my eyes again. As I was about to fall asleep, I heard something running around outside. I opened my eyes just in time to see something speed past the window. I sat up slowly, now fully awake and alert, and then got up and walked over to the window. I lifted the curtain a bit and peeked outside, but I didn't see anything. I looked back into the room, but Ruby wasn't back yet. I could hear more fast-paced footsteps outside, so I looked out into the night again, squinting to try to spot what was out there. As I scanned the fields in the distance, I noticed something odd. At the edge of the field, I could see what appeared to be a cow that had fallen over. At first, I thought it might be the same person responsible for the pigs that was playing some sick joke. I pressed my forehead to the glass, wiping away the fogginess from my breath. As I continued to look out into the field, I saw something crawl over the cow and then hunch over it. After a few seconds, I realized that they were eating the cow's insides. I wanted to back away from the window, but my eyes were glued to the cow and the thing digging around inside of it. I couldn't make out any details in the night, but I thought back to what Grandma Ceci had thought it was, and I was starting to believe that perhaps she was right, and I was witnessing a chupacabra eat one of my grandparents' cows. It almost seemed like a person, but there was something off about the way they moved. They remained crouched down, almost on all fours, but not quite. I suddenly realized that Ruby still hadn't come back, and backed away from the window. I opened the bedroom door and peeked out into the hall. The bathroom door was wide open, and the light was off, meaning Ruby wasn't in there. I slowly stepped out into the hall and checked the other empty bedrooms for Ruby, but they too were empty. I walked into the living room next, only to see multiple dolls sitting on the couches, and then went into the kitchen where I saw more dolls sitting at the kitchen table, but no Ruby. A sudden gunshot ripped through the silence of the night, and I jumped, and then I ducked behind the kitchen table. I held my breath as I heard footsteps outside. I remained still, crouched in the dark, but heard nothing else. I slowly stood up and looked around, but there was no one else in the house. Just as I was starting to feel a little bit calmer, I heard a noise down the hall, coming from one of the bedrooms. I made my way back to the room, whispering Ruby's name into the darkness of the house. Ruby, 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 Ruby. With no response. I stepped into the bedroom and closed the door behind me. As I turned around, I noticed something in the corner of the room and jumped. Ruby, what the fuck? I snapped. I could make out her silhouette sitting on the armchair. What are you doing? I hissed. She didn't reply. Where were you? Did you hear the gunshot? She didn't reply, although I could hear her breathing in the dark. Perhaps she had fallen asleep on the chair by accident. I fumbled around searching for the light switch and flipped the light on once I found it. What I saw made me scream. Ruby was sitting in the armchair, naked and covered in blood. Her hair was stringy, with pink and red chunks tangled in it, and the bottom was slick with blood that dripped down into her arms and bare chest. Her hands were a deep red, and she had chunks of what appeared to be flesh and organs under her nails. Her chin and neck were stained red from the blood that had run down her lips. She was staring straight ahead, but her eyes were fully red. Her legs and feet were filthy with dirt and more blood. There was so much blood, and more kept oozing out from the bullet wound in the back of her head. It was a miracle that she wasn't dead, or perhaps a curse. I don't know how long I screamed. It felt like hours before our grandparents came rushing into the room. Once they saw Ruby, they dragged me outside the room and sat me down on one of those couches. Someone handed me a tea that I sipped on, ignoring the bitter taste. Eventually, a man and a woman arrived, and I watched as they spoke with my grandparents in hushed voices. They all walked back upstairs into the bedroom. After a few minutes, curiosity got the best of me, and I walked back to the bedroom, pushing the door open. Ruby was slumped over in the chair now, dead. I stared at her body, and the smell of death and blood invaded my nostrils. I looked up and noticed that the window was open, and a breeze was gliding through the room, carrying the scent. I gagged. The next few hours were a blur. Someone called my parents, who wanted me on the next flight home, and Grandma Ceci helped me pack my things. I didn't speak much for the next couple of hours, and stood outside and watched my grandparents load my luggage into the car. A tap on my arm caused me to jump, and I looked down to see Raphael holding his hand out to me. He had one of those evil eye bracelets in his palm, and I looked down to make sure mine was still on my wrist. He still had his on as well, and I took the one in his palm. "Whose is this?" I asked, my voice coming out as a whisper. "Ruby's." "Where did you get it?" I asked. "I found it in the barn. It was covered in blood, but I washed it." I swallowed a lump in my throat. "How do you know this is Ruby's?" "Because she's the one who let the demon in."
To my forest friends, thank you for listening to another tale. I hope you enjoy these horrible stories as much as I do. If so, please rip at the like button and scratch a comment. And be sure to subscribe so we can visit here on the Smoking Owl Tales channel next time. And catch you on another night very soon.